Shakespeare's. We're coming to you live from Melbourne tonight, and joining me on the panel, former independent member for Indi, Cathy McGowan, one of the leaders of the community independent movement. Liberal Senator for Victoria, James Paterson, the Labor member for Macnamara, Josh Burns, Economist from the University of New South Wales, Gigi and political and international editor at the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, Peter Hartcher. Please make them all feel welcome.
Final countdown. Are we counting down to an explosion of independence destroying the dreams of the main two parties and leading chaos? Or are we counting down to the launch of a new and better parliament where a wider range of voices will be heard?
Well, Cathy McGowan, you've been working with independents throughout the campaign over the last 6 weeks, I guess passing on some of the secrets of your success as an independent in Parliament. Before we get to Dennis's question about whether it's going to mean chaos or a better Parliament, should we see more independents in there? What's your prediction? Are we going to see what Dennis calls an explosion of independents at this election?
So, Dennis, one of the things about the independents in their running, and there's 23 of them, most of them are running in what's called safe seats, where the margin is great to win is greater than 5% and up to 20-25%. So the chances of them are winning are way outside the odds. They're not marginal seats. So it's a really big thing to win, to get your person elected. What most of the communities are doing are trying to get better representation. They're definitely wanting to make their seats marginal. And if they can get over the line, that's a good thing. So the answer to your question, I reckon prediction-wise, I don't know anything other than what I've been reading in the papers, thanks to the papers and the polling groups, but one in Melbourne, I reckon, one in Sydney and one in Perth.
So one in Melbourne, one in Sydney being those more inner urban teal independents.
The leafy Bayside, they're all leafy Bayside ones. I think one of those will go.
Do you want to tell us which ones?
No, I don't know. But also, and I'm watching, there's a real movement in the country as well in the National Party seats. I don't know if they can actually get over the line, but there's a number of National Party seats that are going to come really close. And I think on election night, there's going to be a massive recount. And it certainly happened when I was elected. They had to go back and do the whole thing again. It came 10 days of waiting before anybody could do anything. And in the end, it was 438 votes. So it was very close.
James Paterson, I mean, Dennis asks if a vote for independence is a vote for chaos or a better parliament. What do you think?
I don't know what's going to happen, but I hope that whoever wins, whoever forms government and provides a Prime Minister is able to do so as a strong majority government and not as a weak minority government. Because I think these are very uncertain times for our country, both on the economic front and on the geopolitical front. And the last thing I think Australia needs is a government that has to bargain for its own existence every day with the crossbench. And one that has to run through really complex policy challenges with independents who all have their different pet issues and will try and bargain them down. I mean, imagine if the last election there had been a hung parliament and Scott Morrison had to negotiate the AUKUS military technology sharing relationship through the crossbench. Imagine if JobKeeper was slowed down.
Did that require legislation?
No,
Sorry.
It doesn't go through Parliament.
Well, if you rely on these people to provide supply and confidence for your government, then I think there is a risk that major policy changes like that could remove that support for your government at any time, and it would be a brave Prime Minister to launch a major initiative without running it past independents or minor parties that they're reliant on. I mean, some of the independents, Zoe Daniel, for example, in Goldstein, has still said even today, months on, that the jury is out on AUKUS. I mean, this is one of our most transformative national security arrangements, I think, since ANZUS 71 years ago, and I think we put those things at risk. And I think JobKeeper would have been so much harder to do if, again, it had to be negotiated person by person on a disparate crossbench where all have different priorities.
So you do use that chaos line. I haven't heard you use that line, but your colleagues do. You do believe a vote for independence is chaos?
Well, I think it's a vote for a weaker government and a weaker country, and I think it will lead to uncertainty. And I think in uncertain times, that's the last thing we need. I want a strong majority government. I mean, obviously, I prefer it to be a Liberal and National one, but if it's not going to be a Liberal and National one, I would rather it be a Labor one than have a weak hung parliament.
So you'd rather a Labor government than a minority Liberal government?
Oh, David, of course I would always prefer that we continue to be in government.
No, you just said you'd prefer, and I just want to be clear on this, you'd prefer a majority Labor government than to be in a minority government.
No, I'm saying that I want a strong parliament that has a majority government of either persuasion. I think that is better than a hung parliament. I think there are very real risks to our country.
So, ipso facto, you are saying you'd rather have a majority Labor government than be in minority.
David, I hear what you're saying. What I'm saying
I'm just checking what you just said.
What I'm saying is, of course, I want Scott Morrison to continue to be Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Of course, I want the Liberal National Party to continue to be in government. But I would much rather that be in a majority government. And if Labor is successful, if they do provide the Prime Minister, I would rather that they're able to do so in their own right, rather than relying on the crossbenches.
Cathy McGowan, I'll just get you to respond to what we just said.
Just let me just give a quick response to that. Now, I just want you to remember, and many of you will, August 2018, when there was one of the most unseemly fights that I have ever been part of, when the Prime Minister, strong Prime Minister doing his job, Malcolm Turnbull, was attacked from the rear by Peter Dutton, said, I want to be Prime Minister, and his ego came out and he had a massive, I'm the one to win. And then coming up from the side was Scott Morrison, who said, no, none of you guys, it's me. If ever we've had chaos in government, it was that week, when those egos, and I'm not even talking about the Senate, that's just the House of Reps. Those egos were like bulls in China shops. There was chaos. The phones were ringing hot. Everyone was saying, Cathy, where are you going to go? What are you going to do? Andrew Walkie, Rebecca Sharkey and I, we held Australia together in that chaos. It wasn't Labor. It wasn't the Liberal Party. It was the three of us talking to everybody. Calm down, blokes. It's okay. It's not going to go. You're in safe hands here. It was so bad that people like Julia Banks left the party in disgust. Other members of the Senate, women members of the Senate, got up and said, it's never been this bad. Now, that all got dampered down. Now, I don't think we were chaotic. I'll leave it up to the rest of Australians to think about that. But there's just one more example I just want to place on the table. Before you were there, Senator Paterson, 2017. Do you remember Section 44, when the dual citizenship happened? The Deputy Prime Minister had to go back to his seat. All those senators had to leave. The President of the Senate had to resign. Who held the government of Australia in safe hands then? It wasn't the Liberal Party. It wasn't the Labor Party. It was the crossbench.
David, just quickly on that.
I just want to go to some other panellists here for a moment. Peter, going back a little further than those examples, we did have a hung parliament after the 2010 election. This was the minority Gillard government. Now, there are very mixed views on whether that was chaotic or a great period of cooperation, collaboration and passing legislation. What's your memories of that time?
Well, the source of instability and chaos with that minority federal government in Australia wasn't the crossbenchers, it was the Labor Party itself, the Labor government itself, which then threw itself once again into another one of those frenzies of self-indulgence. It's my turn to be leader. So the situation that Cathy, you've just reminded us of the Liberal Party leadership churn. Well, remember, Labor did it too. This was a very peculiar syndrome that both parties went through. And, James is from the Liberal Party. The Liberal Premier in New South Wales has a different view to James's view. Dominic Perrottet says that he works every day, he's got a minority government. He says that having to rely on a crossbench has actually made his government better because they have to work issues through and they can't just assume that they're going to have a majority on every vote.
Well, Josh, what's your concerns, if you do have them, about the prospect, the possibility of being in a minority government? Does it worry you as much as it would worry James Paterson?
Well, it sounds like James might be voting for me, which is exciting. But, but Dennis, I'd go back to Dennis's question, and I'd say this, Dennis, I've spent the last 2 weeks on pre-poll, and I'm pretty knackered, but it's a beautiful thing seeing democracy unfold. You know, it's a beautiful thing seeing people from the left of politics to the right of politics and some quirky characters in the middle all coming together and standing on a street and putting forward their ideas about what's the best thing for our country. And, and I hope that we're successful and I hope that we have a chance to form government. But I think that diversity in democracy is a good thing. The other thing I would say about the independent movement, Dennis, is that I think one of the things that's really lacking in politics right now is a sense of trust in politics and a sense of trust in our political leadership. And I think one of the most profound things that a politician can do right now is be a part of the establishment of a strong, independent anti-corruption commission. I think that will leave our parliament in a better place than we found it. So great question, Dennis.
I'm not sure if we're going to answer, though, to the question about whether you're worried. Would you be concerned about being in a minority government?
I'm worried anyway, David. It's 2 days before an election and, and of course I'm nervous about the state of the country. I'm nervous that Morrison can win and I think that it's entirely possible. We've been here in 2019 where everyone sort of assumed that the Labor Party was going to win the election and that's what I'm nervous about. But no, I think no matter which party forms government, no one's going to control the Senate and I think one of the strengths of Anthony Albanese was that he did negotiate with people to get forward legislation during the Gillard government.
Doesn't worry.
No, I'm relaxed about it.
Well, Gigi, what about you? What's your view on independents and their role in Parliament?
Well, I wouldn't just say independents are potentially important this election, but anybody who's not one of the major parties. And the reason is I very much agree with the blokes on either side that diversity is a source of strength in a democracy. And we've seen that in the most recent historical example of the last couple of years, when we've seen the most catastrophic betrayal of the Australian people in terms of poor health policy management that I've ever seen in Australia. I think that we've seen for a generation, and we're going to be carrying the cost of that for a generation. And that's down to both major parties and their supporters, the Greens and the Nationals. Sorry, gentlemen. And so I think that the obvious thing to do is to put everybody else first and the 2 majors and 2 supporting people last on the ballot, because Saturday is the Australian people's opportunity to pay back for the betrayals of the last 2 years. And it'll be the independents and it'll be all the what we call freedom-friendly minor parties. So UAP, IMOP, Australian Federation Party, all these other ones, they've all been popping up for a very good reason, which is that people who think that a monoculture and a single way of doing things is the right approach have abused that power and have crushed people's dreams in this country and set us back hugely that we'll be feeling for a generation.
My question to the panel is, we have all heard Mr Scott Morrison has decided not to be a bulldozer-style Prime Minister if he is re-elected. I believe in the old saying, a leopard can't change its spots. And after watching the interview with Lee Sales and Mr Scott Morrison, I am convinced he can never change. Shouldn't we judge him on his past deeds rather than promises to change in the future?
Now, Cathy McGowan, that was Brenda McGowan. I do need to point out you come from a big McGowan clan. You're one of 13 kids, but Brenda's not part of your clan.
Hello, Brenda.
Anyway,
great question. I'm fascinated to hear the answer
let's
to
start
that
with you on that, because Brenda's asking about this concession from Scott Morrison that he's been a bit of a bulldozer. What did you make of that? And whether do you think he can change?
I would love to see it. And I say this really genuinely. There's a huge amount of room for improvement in our government, and I just want what's best for Australia. I really do. And if Scott Morrison can get to this stage of the election and honestly say he hasn't been as good as he could have been, and he could have been better, I really welcome that, and I think the people of Australia would welcome it too. And then they will make their decision at the polling booth whether they think they'll make a choice about that. But I really welcome that comment from him, because I think there's been a lot of times, and certainly for some of the women that I know who think he could have been kinder and gentler, and I would have liked to have seen that. So I thank him for his acknowledgement. I wish him well, because one of the hardest things is to change yourself. That's a really big task. But he's clearly said that he'll set about it, so I wish him well, and the people of Australia will make a choice.
Well, Senator, let me ask you, because we're talking about your leader, the Prime Minister. Does he need to change?
The last 3 years have been very tough for Australia and Australians. We've had floods, we've had fires, we've had a pandemic. We now have the largest ground war in Europe since World War II. And it's required some pretty tough and some pretty decisive leadership. And I don't think you'd want to see, as we move out of that phase, as we move into a post-COVID era, as we focus on the economic recovery, the same kind of strong, assertive leadership that you saw in crisis in normal times. Hopefully these are now peaceful and prosperous and conflict-free times, and it will require a different style of leadership. And I think that's what the Prime Minister was signalling.
Right,
he knows,
so he wasn't talking about changing himself?
No, I think he was talking about changing himself.
How,
I think,
that's what I want to get to. How's he going to change?
Well, he ran a very tough and very small government in the middle of a crisis where decisions had to be made really quickly, where you couldn't go through the normal sort of consultation and careful consideration. You had to make decisions on the fly because we were confronted at the beginning of the pandemic with a warning from Treasury that unemployment could hit 15%. We were confronted with warnings from the Health Department that tens of thousands of Australians could die. And so quick decisions had to be made to shut our international borders, to put in place economic supports like JobKeeper. And that doesn't lend itself to kinder, gentler politics. It's very quick and sometimes very tough politics.
Just to pick up your language there, we'll see a kinder, gentler Scott Morrison?
Well, I think it'll be a more consultative Scott Morrison. I think it'll be a Scott Morrison that takes the time to bring people with him because I hope he'll have the luxury of that in more peaceful times where urgent decision-making isn't required.
So kinder, gentler and more consultative?
Yeah, I think so.
Peter Hartcher, what did you make of why Scott Morrison felt the need to talk about being a bulldozer and the need to change and this description that we're going to see a kinder, gentler, more consultative Prime Minister?
Well, to me, David, it looked like a deathbed conversion. Where suddenly looking at electoral oblivion, he decided that he would, he'd have to change. That's how I interpreted it. And it's also, to me, just a clear signal that he felt the election campaign slipping away from him.
He's not the first leader in trouble to promise, that they will change. The description of himself as a bulldozer, of course, was interesting here, and it was followed yesterday by these images, which I'm sure everybody has seen by now, of the PM bowling over an 8-year-old on a soccer field, sort of reinforcing the bulldozer image there, I suppose. But the kid's fine. The kid's A-OK. Peter, to the question that Brenda asks, should we believe a Prime Minister at this point, in this political position, when they say they are going to change?
No, I don't think you can. I think you judge someone on their record. And I think, James has said kinder and gentler would be a better mode. But the thing is that a leader has to respond to whatever circumstances present. In a major crisis, we could have done with more of bulldozer Morrison. With the bushfires and the floods, the country was crying out for Scott Morrison, for the Prime Minister to take leadership in those crises, and he didn't. Bulldozer Morrison, has a place in those circumstances. Kinder and gentler, when there were crises with a rape being committed in the ministerial wing of Parliament House, when there were other atrocities going on, he could have shown more empathy. When there was a march of women for justice in Parliament House that he refused to meet. He said that they could send some representatives perhaps, but he wouldn't meet the crowd. Those were moments for empathy, for being caring and considerate. So a national leader has to be able to find within him or herself the qualities to meet the moment. There's no one mode.
Gigi?
I tend to agree. It's politically expedient to say this, of course. And this is what we see every election in Australia, right? What gets votes is someone who seems to be somewhat, self-deprecating and also appeals to the pocketbook of the voter. And I'm sure we'll be talking about those policy proposals right now, and they're pointing to things that are about the pocketbook. And they're trying to distract away from the real issue, which is that for the last 2 years, we've had mismanagement from both big parties.
Can I ask you, Josh Burns, part of the reason Scott Morrison's unpopularity is an issue in this campaign is that Labor has very effectively gone after him over things like, going to Hawaii and the bushfires, going missing, some of the comments, don't hold a hose and so on, portraying him as a liar from the Shire and all of that. How important has this negative attack on Scott Morrison been to the Labor campaign?
Well, there's a couple of things I'd say. First of all, it hasn't been the Labor Party that's effectively made character assessments on Scott Morrison.
You've had a bit to do with it, to be fair.
Members of the Liberal Party. You've got Gladys Berejiklian, you've got Malcolm Turnbull, even the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, said famously, "I don't think I know that he's a liar." So I think that there's been a long line of people wanting to make an assessment on Scott Morrison's character. Going back to Brenda's question, though, I'd say this. Like, he's not changing. You know, this is as good as he's going to get. And what this Prime Minister has been for the past 3 years is what he will be, plus more for the next 3 years if he's given another chance to govern our country. You know, this guy has been a handbrake on climate action, a handbrake on a range of different things, a handbrake on Integrity Commission. He's not changing, and we either are going to wake up on Sunday with another 3 years of Scott Morrison, or we're going to wake up with something better.
Before we move on, a little earlier in the discussion there was a reference to a rape being committed in Parliament. I would just like to clarify they are allegations. That matter is before the courts.
I'm a 35-year-old woman and I still rent. And I was actually in shock about this announcement to withdraw 50K in order to buy a house. First of all, the height of Scott Morrison, to presume that I even have 50K in the first place, means just he's so out of touch, especially with women's issues. After surviving domestic abuse and violence and living on the below poverty rate of Centrelink in my 20s, I have less than 30K in my super. And we currently pay more in rent than a mortgage repayment would be. So my question is for James Paterson. Are you aware if there were any women in or near the room when this idea was concocted?
Thank you for your question and thank you for sharing your experience. To answer directly, yes, Jane Hume is the Minister for Superannuation and she was directly involved in formulating the policy. And I understand that this is not a policy that will work for everyone. It's not compulsory, it's optional, and some people will take it up and some people won't. But part of your story was really interesting. You said you're paying more on rent than you would on a mortgage. Well, for some people, it would help them if they're finding it really difficult to save for a deposit. And if they could take money out of their superannuation, that would get them the deposit they need to buy a house and then pay those lower mortgage repayments rather than paying higher rent. Now, I accept it might not work for you, it won't work for everyone, but for some people, it's a game changer. And I've met dozens of young people just over the last week on pre-poll booths while handing out how to vote cards come up to me and tell me how excited they are about this and how it's going to bring forward their purchase of their first home.
Look, just to pick up Leah's point though, she's really talking about the gender disparity here. Just to give you some stats, the average super balance for a male aged 30 to 34 is about $51,000. For a female in that same age bracket, it's about $42,000, and it's the same across all the age brackets. Is there a point here that this policy will inevitably mean the bloke who's turning up at the auction will have more in their pocket when they're bidding than the woman?
There's no question, David, there is a disparity between men's and women's superannuation, and that's a complex problem and a serious one. And this policy doesn't propose to try and solve that problem. We are trying to solve the problem for young people who want to get into the housing market and can't, and have a bucket of their own money waiting there, which they would quite like to access, but currently are prevented from doing so. So, as I said, it's not for everyone, but I think it will make a difference to a lot of young people.
Can I just ask a follow-up question? So I've been on pre-poll too. Great question, I have to say. Thank you for that, Leah, because a woman of similar age to you came up to me and she said, Cathy, can you explain to me what happens with this? You know, like, if I put my super into this and we get divorced, what happens then? A good question.
What's the answer to that?
Look, I assume it's the same as all family law disputes and they're resolved in that way. I mean, I'm not sure how it would be any different from any other shared asset.
Considering the dominant focus on national security and economic indicators, I think it's fair to say that this federal election campaign has oriented around risk aversion and occasionally fear, rather than reform and opportunity. Is it unrealistic to have hoped for anything different?
I want to get everybody's quick thoughts on this. Cathy, McGowan, what's happened to reform?
Ben, and just for the listeners at home, there's a really young audience here tonight, and I just want to say to you young people particularly, yes. And you're not, if we keep doing the same thing, we're going to get the same result. And that's one of the reasons why in these 23 plus electorates, so many young people are getting behind their independence and saying, I just want someone with a vision, someone who's actually going to represent me and my generation and act on it. And it's no surprise that climate change comes to the fore at all. It's no surprise that integrity is there. And there's lots of other issues coming out. So I say yes, but the call is to you. You have to vote for it. If you vote the same way, you get the same result. So that's what's happening around Australia. People have actually realised that democracy is not a spectator sport. You actually got to dive in and you've got to do something different. You've actually got to engage with politics and make a really clear decision. And it's not just the independents. It's looking at your vote in a serious way in the Senate.
Well,
so I'll just finish on this. To the young people here tonight, pay particular attention to the vision of the parties. Are they actually making Australia the place you want to be? On Aboriginal, on the Uluru Statement, for example, what are they doing in terms of the Republic to the future governance of this country? Like, we haven't even talked about that. And the Queen's birthday, you know, she's coming up. Like, she's not going to be there for much longer. So what's the country going to do then? Do we just fall in behind Charlie?
Well,
like, I don't know. But it's no, what I'm saying is...
You've opened up a few issues here that unfortunately we don't have time for.
But what Ben's saying is we haven't got the discussion about the vision.
All right, now, James Paterson, Coalition's hoping for a fourth term in government. To Ben's question, what are the reforms? What's one big reform you'd want to deliver in a fourth term?
Well, I think we've talked about some of those big reforms tonight, and they're competing plans from the Labor Party and the Liberal Party about how to improve housing affordability. They want the government to be a co-owner with you in your home. We want you to own your own home using your own money. That's a big reform idea.
That's your big reform idea?
But to your point about the focus on other issues, I mean, the national security risks facing this country, unfortunately, are very real, and we would be doing you and your generation a disservice if we weren't being honest with you about that. These are the most uncertain strategic times that Australia has been in since the 1930s, and I seriously worry about whether or not we'll be able to pass on the free, prosperous, democratic country we have to future generations if we don't muscle up and confront those challenges. And I think you deserve to know about that and to make an informed choice about it at the ballot box.
Josh Burns, reform for you. Can you cite for us the big reforms that Labor would like to deliver?
Ben, when you think about the sort of work experience that people are going to have in this country, you know, the 40 years, what have you got to show for it? Young people in Australia going into the working place, and they're going into insecure work, they're going into casualised work, their wages are stagnant, housing is less affordable. What have you got to show for your 40 years of contributing to this country? You know, we need to change that. And the way we change that is by making more jobs more secure and a pathway to permanency. We also need to tackle climate change. We need to transition. Like, we are going to be the generation that does this, mate. We are going to be the ones that do this. We're going to transition from fossil fuels to renewable technology. It's going to be us, and it's going to be amazing, and we're going to make a lot of money on the way. And finally, our democracy. Like, we have to protect our democracy and lift the standards of politics in this country. They've had their turn, right? Like, they've had 10 years. It's our time. Let's change the government and let's do it for our country.
All right, Gigi, what sort of reform would you have liked to have heard from the two?
Oh, boy. I mean, it's been 2 years of propaganda and treating everybody like imbeciles. I think that what we would really like to see is a return to happy, free, joyful Australia, get rid of all the freedom restrictions that we've seen in the last 2 years, including all the mandates and the coercion and the border closures and the testing and the tracking and the tracing and the masking. All that stuff's got to go. It doesn't help. It doesn't help on net. And so it's not worth it. The government still has not defended it except by these, 40,000 figures that come out of a computer box. And it hasn't done a cost-benefit analysis. You shouldn't trust them. So I think we should see more freedom. We should see more critical thought. I'd like to see some reform in education. I'd like to see universal basic childcare. And I'd like to see more support for Australia being a strong country that allows its businesses and its people to have freedom and commits to not ever taking it away.
Peter Hartcher, I'm going to give you the final word here. And coming back to Ben's question, has reform become too hard? Are we too risk averse now, and particularly in this campaign?
Australia's traditional enemy is complacency, and that's an enemy that never gives up, and we can't give up. The enemy at the moment is winning, so we have to fight a bit harder. And that especially means your generation too.
All right, well said. That's all we have time for tonight. Thanks to our panel, Cathy McGowan, James Paterson, Josh Burns, Gigi Foster and Peter Hartcher.